Yeah, fantastic. So it's great to have you here today. I was really looking forward to speaking with you because I really enjoyed your story. And so, how are you doing?
Doing okay. A little bit floored still. Um, I think I told you in an email that my entry last month, which also got published, was the first short story I've ever submitted to a contest.
That's
So I never
fantastic.
expected this.
Well, I'm very glad that it happened this way. What made you submit the story this month or last? Well, last month is your first one. Was that your first? Sorry, you said contest, but was that your first submission to like a
Yeah.
magazine or publication of any kind?
Yes, it was.
No. Okay. So,
Um,
what made you?
I submitted some poetry back when I was, a teenager and thought that poetry was a thing I was going to do. But fortunately, nobody took me seriously. Um, I have been writing forever, but I have a novel and I've been workshopping the novel forever, and you don't really send a full novel
No.
to a magazine. So it hadn't even occurred to me until I saw Max Gladstone tweeting about the contest. Um, Full disclosure, I do know Max in real life.
Oh,
So
really? Very cool.
yeah. Um, so I figured anything that he was putting his name behind had to be pretty legit.
Yeah. That's great. How do you know Max?
um, so some mutual friends of ours got me involved in a role-playing game at some point, I think was how we met. But I mean, certainly I've been to a number of his book signings. I love the craft sequence. How You Lose the Time War is,
Well, fantastic.
oh, it's such a good book. I love it so much.
It's
So
amazing.
yeah, I've known him for several years. I wouldn't say we're, you know, I wouldn't say that we have been entwined particularly in a writing context, but
Mhm. I wondered if it might be from academia because I know that he was is quite involved in that, and I believe that you were involved in the academic world, still
yeah.
are in any capacity.
So I was getting my PhD in classics in um, ancient Greek and Roman literature. And I was actually at the point of ABD, which is I had done everything except for my dissertation when when COVID hit,
Mm.
and um, I had been dealing with a lot of. I mean, academia is just full of tons of nonsense. I mean, you may have heard of just even this past couple of days. There's been this new scandal with Harvard with an
Oh, no, I
abusive
haven't heard.
professor, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
Academia is full of this nonsense, harassment and abuse, and the silencing of minority voices and even non-minority voices who just care. Uh, so it's a bit of a stew up there in the ivory tower, and I had been fighting against some things in my own department for several years, and they came to kind of a head around then. And then at the same time, when COVID hit, my university had decided that it was going to force all of its grad students to come work on campus with basically no precautions or effectively lose their funding.
Oh, wow.
And, and um, that was the last straw for me. So I tried one more time to sort of organize the grad students and like get somewhere, but nothing changed in the end, and I couldn't do it.
Well,
So
that's very disheartening for
um,
sure. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
so so yeah, I love academia and I hate academia.
Yeah.
I am still involved in terms of I've been invited to present at some conferences and stuff, but I don't have any plans to go back into it properly.
And what are you
Um,
doing since you sort of left? Is writing something that's filling up your time majorly, or is there any other activities that you're doing?
yeah, actually, I've been doing a lot of writing. Um, I've been I've been sort of working on finding an agent for the book,
Mhm.
or maybe I should go the self-publishing route. It's one of those big
Tough choice
ongoing
sometimes.
questions.
Yeah.
Um, but I also have started a YouTube channel, and that's actually primarily what my time gets spent on in between like freelance stuff, some tutoring and editing and stuff, whatever
I haven't
works.
had time to check out your YouTube channel, but I was aware of it. Is it writing focused, or is it focused on your area of study for like the classics?
So I do have a lot of videos that focus in on sort of like mythology and linguistics and stuff like that. But a lot of what I do is actually more about, I guess I'll call it leftist politics. I'm not super into like the news, but I'm really interested in, I have a big series on Jewish identity in the modern world and how anti-Semitism appears on both the right and the left. Mm-hmm. I have, a 30-minute rant about fat phobia and the medical industry. So I talk a lot about that. I talk some about board games, which is another big hobby of mine. And I talk about...
It's an interesting mix of subjects for sure.
Yeah. I'm actually inspired by the last conference I was presenting at. I'm actually going to start live streaming a scholarly commentary version of a video game starting this weekend.
That sounds cool. That sounds interesting.
All sorts of stuff.
What was the conference about that inspired you to do that?
So it was this conference, Antiquity and Media Studies, which is all about sort of how classical mythology and such, how stories of the ancient world inspire and are received in modern storytelling and modern media. So talk about things like, Immortals Phoenix Rising, which is, you're playing a Greek hero wandering around an open world, or, the Percy Jackson series, mm-hmm. where you get these grand retellings, but even things that aren't quite as direct. So I was actually there to talk about how to incorporate gaming into pedagogy, which is a big hobby of mine. I'm really interested in the ways that we process information via play, mm-hmm. in different ways than we process it via, sort of just hearing or reading the information. Because, and this ties back to my writing, like I always think about the narrative, mm-hmm. like how do you connect to that narrative?
Absolutely. I mean, story kind of underlies everything that we do. All things are stories, and that's one of the ways that humans can remember things, relate to things, and learning through story, I think, is super valuable. We can learn a lot from exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
And that's why your French textbook had you follow an exchange student around a high school or something.
Something we can relate to. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what inspired you to start writing?
Oh gosh.
And how long have you been doing for have you been writing since you were, you learned to write, or is it something
possibly even before? I have memories of being a tiny child and just making up these grand stories and acting them out with my friends, and sometimes demanding that we put them on as plays. But yeah, I think the first short story that I wrote, I think my mom still has it, was in like the first or second grade, where, we could write about whatever we wanted for a couple of pages. And I wrote an alien invasion story where I saved the school. So awesome. So I really can't remember a time where I wasn't writing something. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think that makes this feel all the weirder, because these have just been what I do in my free time when I'm not thinking about putting it out into the world. I scribble, right? Yeah. But apparently that worked out.
So your goal hasn't really ever been to be published. Like your writing wasn't writing to, I mean, obviously you want to be eventually, but your writing wasn't writing specifically to get published and be a published author. You're writing because you really just enjoy the stories and telling them.
Yes and no. I mean, certainly it wasn't the only thing behind it, but once I realized that I could do that, it started to be a goal of mine. I know enough about, how publishing works and how things get onto shelves to not have felt like it was a given that I would someday become a published author. But, I wrote a book. It'd be nice if other people read it someday. I think that'd be great. And
Absolutely.
I mean, at this point in my life, I think that one of my goals is to be able to spend my time being a creative rather than, working an office job or going back into academia.
I think that's a
So,
great goal. Why don't you actually tell me about the book? Because I don't,
yeah.
is it finished and you're working on an agent, or is it still going through
Yeah,
drafts
no,
and revisions or anything?
I actually wrote it a few years ago. And it's gone through a couple of edits since then. Not a full professional edit because, grad school, but, uh, and grad school money at that.
Yeah.
So, but it's as finished as it can be with just me working on it, and I have been sort of half-heartedly looking for an agent,
Mhm.
I would say, because, like I said, I have trouble believing that other people really want to read this. But every time that I actually work with somebody, they say that it's got potential. So I keep
Well,
trying.
that's fantastic.
So I've
Yeah.
been putting it out on PitMad, the pitch wars on Twitter.
Okay,
Um,
great.
so there's a little hashtag PitMad, and I think it's twice a year, 3 times a year. People just put their pitches out in a single tweet, and if you get a like from an agent, that means they're requesting a submission. And sometimes
Oh,
small publishers will like it too.
nice.
So I've gotten a couple of likes from that, but they've never gone anywhere so far.
Right. What's the
But
title of the book?
the working title is The Amaranth Library. So it's a fantasy piece,
Mhm.
strong environmental themes. The main characters are a half Japanese thug with swords and
Sorry,
a
did you say bug?
half thug.
Thug. Okay, so yeah.
She's a fighter. Um, she's kind of a Wild West bully, and her counterpart is this like very sort of fluffy, scholarly teenage fairy girl who wants to go to university, and both of them get dumped in this jungle and are like, what the heck?
That sounds like a great setup, actually. I like it. I'll read it. And you said you mentioned that you had I think you mentioned this in one of our emails, is that your first story the first one that we published, Catabasis, you have plans to expand that into a novel, or was it a hush hush
Yeah.
thing?
Well,
I can
I mean,
edit
I
this out.
tweeted it in public, so it's not that hush hush. Yes, actually, I started working on that story in sort of the back of my head a lot longer ago, in fact, than I worked on my novel that got finished, but I've never really gone back to it. It started as this sort of epic sci-fi dream that I had, and I woke up and I just had this vision of Juan just at the end of the story, which I will not give away
No,
because
yeah. Well, I mean, I
the
hope one day to
catabasis
read it,
is right
so I
in the
don't want you
middle
to
of
give that bit away.
it. But yeah, so I do have I have Juan's whole story in the back of my head, and I have pieces of it written. And I wasn't really even thinking about writing catabasis as a single piece until I saw the prompt, and I was like, oh, I have something for this.
Oh, okay. And so would that be sort of a scene from the book, probably, that
Mm-hmm.
directly kind of just pulled out? Because it really did seem like it was part of a longer work, which is often very cool, especially with short stories, because I just wanted to know more.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's sort of in the early middle of the arc for Juan.
Mm-hmm.
And like I have some little like lines in there where he flashes back to the madman who he got caught up with, and like his safe little apartment, and like I actually have scenes of all of that. That's actually the part I already had written.
Okay.
So so his story starts in a much calmer place. And the
Not as calm as the isolation chambers, though.
Oh gosh.
That particular bit of it where it's kind of noted that it's supposed to be therapeutic, and I'm assuming that other people actually do like it, and they think they like it, but being locked in something like that and not liking it is horrifying to me.
Yeah. I mean, I had the idea a long time ago, but with the advent of, have you heard of like float chambers?
I mean, people,
where you
it's what is it? Sensory deprivation. It's supposed to be very, very relaxing, actually, and it's still very expensive. I think for it's hundreds of dollars for an hour to float around.
Yeah. So when I heard about that, I was like, this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm thinking about, where, if somebody is dealing with sensory overwhelm, for instance, from any number of reasons, this can sound very appealing, but imagine if you were forced into it. Imagine if you had no choice.
Yeah.
And imagine if you couldn't say, okay, I'm done.
Oh, God. Yeah. I don't like that. It makes me extremely uncomfortable.
The thing is, most medicines are poison, just dialed down to a very small dose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's why you can't take too many Advils in a day or something like that, because poison you.
Willow bark will poison you if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I feel like I'm saying this wrong. Catabasis. You said it and it went back much faster.
So I say catabasis. It's a Greek word. See also scholarly background. Sorry, but it means a walking down, a going down, and it is actually the specific term that's used to refer to going to the underworld in stories like the Odyssey, or the stories of Hercules, that sort of thing.
Dante, yeah.
So I specifically wanted this feeling of, he's up in space and he's descending to Earth, but the Earth is dead, right? The Earth is the underworld in a couple of different ways. So, and I wanted that feeling to contrast with him looking up at the sky and being like, this is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, that imagery definitely works for it. Catabasis and Holy, Holy, Holy are radically different stories. Just almost as different as you can be. So I was pretty surprised, actually, when I found out that you were the author of Holy, 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 because my experience with you was catabasis. So do you want to speak to that a little bit? Like, are you more of a fantasy writer? Because your book is fantasy and catabasis is very science fiction, speculative. And Holy, 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 actually, I missed the fantasy elements of it. I missed the magic on my first read through. I just thought it was wonderful. And when I went back and read it again, I've read it quite a number of times now, but when I read it the second time, I was kind of like, hey, wait a second, that urn turned to flowers. That's not, it's magic. So there is still that aspect of it, but it's very much more grounded in sort of real life, present day. So do you often write things that are like that, or?
I would say that my main sort of focus in terms of genre is probably fantasy. I obviously am also a big fan of sci-fi and other sort of spec fic sort of things. Holy, Holy, Holy is a pretty unique one for me. The idea came from a terrible pun, right?
I did see your tweet before you deleted it. I went, oh no, I think I missed it. Like, unless it's Holy, 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 the pun is like, is that it with the?
Yes. Yeah, so okay. When I learned about, like years ago, when I first learned about the ceremony of Holi, I developed sort of the final image from that story of a Jewish woman standing in the middle of this cloud of of colors
Mhm.
and just saying kadosh, 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 and rising up on her toes. And like that's where it came from.
Right, that
It
makes
came
sense.
from a bad pun. And I like to say that this is the story where I pun so hard that I made people cry.
So why tell me that story? Who somebody just thought it was so funny that they cried?
Oh no, it's just that since this is a very, it wound up being such a personal grief that a lot of the people who read it for me or read it after it was published have told me that they teared up.
I did, especially, yeah, on my first read through, I kind of felt some emotion, quite a bit of emotion. I went, oh, this is that's how I know things are big contenders, is when I kind of feel that kind of thing. I also cry at commercials on TV sometimes, so I'm sensitive to things like that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I read it, I felt some strong emotions, and I liked it a lot. So that inspiration was just from that imagery when you found out.
Yeah.
Are the characters in any way sort of, are you, first of all, I think first of all, we should start at the beginning, is, are you Jewish or very familiar? It seems from that writing that you're very familiar with the Jewish and also sort of the culture around Holi. Is it Hindu? Not actually
Yes.
sure.
Yeah, it's a Hindu festival.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes, I was raised Jewish. I'm not particularly religious, but I like learning about everything, and I did grow up.
Well, that's why I ask, is because authors often research quite a bit. Like, you could have just been an enthusiast of the Jewish religion and then written a story about it.
Yeah.
So you were raised.
And that is how I got to Holi, right? Because I've actually never experienced Holi, although I kind of desperately want to now that I know more about it. But actually, I was chatting with a friend of mine who does celebrate Holi, who grew up in India. And, she was telling me about it. And I'm like, can I ask you a bunch of random writerly questions about this? Because I kind of have this idea. And she said, oh, yeah, sure. Ask me anything. And I'm like, so what does it taste like? Like all of these weird questions.
That's actually a great question. That wouldn't be the first one off the top of my head, but I mean, that really immersed us in the story when you use the senses like that. And that, so I'm very glad that you thought to ask that and then include it in the story. And that's what she said.
Yeah, that it's kind of this bitter metallic taste. And I had no idea about, actually, the mauli was her idea, the red string. I had never heard of that before talking to her about this. But just in sort of workshopping the idea with somebody who had experienced the other half of what I needed for it, it all came together. And like, I hadn't been quite sure how I was going to incorporate red. And then this red string that is a blessing that any ordinary worshiper can do. Like, this is perfect. This is exactly what I want.
Yeah, that fit right in perfectly. It's funny too, because I have a red string on. I don't know if it's anything like the Maui, because I've never seen one, and it has nothing to do with that at all, but I happen to have it on my wrist. So I read this red string and kind of looked down and went, oh, that's cool.
There are a bunch of red string specific lore in different cultures. When I think of red string, I think of the Japanese tradition, that there's a sort of a red string that binds you to the person you're supposed to be with.
Yeah, it's very cool. What was I going to ask? Yeah, so where did you get the inspiration for the characters in the story? Because I mean, it follows sort of two old ladies, and you don't often, well, one old lady, and it doesn't follow the other one. But you don't often see the protagonists of stories sort of being the elderly. And so I was interested to know sort of where you came up with that, and what reason you chose to sort of follow Vera's journey. Vera or Vera?
I thought of it as Vera.
Vera.
So Vera is in part based on my mother. Sorry, Mom. No, she's very familiar to me. I can imagine myself in that, and I can imagine, a lot of the older Jewish women I know who are very nice people, but sometimes have this like blind spot culturally with other religions, especially. Um, and I wanted to make her feel like someone I knew, someone I could sort of inhabit. Savita, on the other hand, she just came from whole cloth. I've known a number of South Asian women, and I guess she's sort of an amalgamation of that, but none of them have been particularly elderly. So that was just kind of coming from a place of looking for a way to tie the experience together. And one thing that I always like is when you do see female or at least non-male protagonists who aren't young and beautiful.
Yeah.
Because it's so uncommon. And, you know, I have read Lois McMaster Buchholz's Paladin of Souls dozens of times now, because I love the feeling of a dumpy middle-aged woman gets to be the star.
Yeah. That's I've experimented in some of my writings with an old lady as sort of the protagonist, and I quite enjoy it because it's also very limiting. It happens to be more of a fantasy, a bit of a event action-y kind of thing. So for me, it was very interesting to find the limitations of the lady, because I can't just have her run across the city or join a battle or do these things. Like, she's got trouble going up a lot of stairs, so she can't just come to the rescue of other characters like you could have the hero with a broadsword do. So right. I found that quite a lot of fun, and I think that you absolutely nailed the characters. Like Savita, I could easily picture the sort of old doting sort of Indian grandmother being sort of vivacious and stern and telling it as it is kind of thing. I saw it perfectly. I loved it. Mm-hmm. And
I've appreciated the quotes you've taken from her.
I try to pull the quotes without giving too much away of the story. There's some towards the end that I would have liked to use, but I prefer to make sure, like, the goal is to get more people to read it, so I want them to not be totally ruined or anything like that. And I loved the things she said. It was great. Do you want to walk me through sort of how you generally generate your ideas? Because you write often. So, I mean, Holy, Holy, Holy came from sort of that imagery. Is that sort of how you generally get things? Like, you just observing the world, or how do you go? What's your process for kind of finding ideas and filtering the ones that you want to write about?
Well, this is going to sound a little bit tacky, but honestly, most of my ideas come from my dreams. I have really vivid dreams, and oftentimes they come with these elaborate backstories, and I'm like, that would be really interesting to explore. And so I'll start from there. But sometimes it is just a pun or an image that I like, a line of poetry that gets stuck in my head, and instead of trying to turn it into poetry, I'll turn it into a story. So yeah, I guess it's more of an organic process for me than I often hear people talk about. I don't sort of sit down and go, this would be a really neat metaphor for this thing I want to talk about. It's much more of I find something that I'm interested in, and I see where it leads me.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And when you're blessed with sort of just being able to kind of do that intuitively, have the dreams, I often, it's not tacky to me, I often have these dreams. Sometimes when I'm writing things, I will have these dreams where I wake up and it's 4:30 in the morning, and I go, that's how this works. And I have to get out my phone and spend half an hour writing down what I just happened, because it fits perfectly into the story that I'm trying to tell. And that's great. And so you can always figure out what to do for the metaphors on the back end coming through the second draft if you really have to. So that's great. Tell me about plotting. Do you spend time plotting, or do you just sort of write? Like, did you plan out either catabasis or Holy, Holy, Holy before you sat down to write? Did you sort of have an idea how things were going to go, or did you sit down and create?
Well, I mean, for both of them, I started with an idea of what the story was before I was writing. Like the image of a Jewish woman standing in the middle of a holy celebration saying the Kaddish, it's a very specific feeling. And I'm like, well, how do we get there? Probably a good friend of hers died. Like that's like where my brain went right away. So I'm like, well, how does that come together? And that's the sort of plotting that I did. Like I didn't, especially for something this short, I didn't sit there and kind of like outline or anything. And honestly, when I was working on my novel, it felt very similar. Again, I started from this dream image that I had, the very first scene of the book in this case, where my main character she's fishing in the middle of the jungle, like in a stream, and this girl falls out of the sky onto her head and she just goes, fuck.
I mean, that sounds dreamlike for sure.
And like, and so like from there, I'm like, why does, like, I had all of this knowledge of how the first character had gotten into this position, but none about the second. So I started thinking, okay, well, if this is true, then what does that mean for that? And I kind of bounced it around until I knew where the story was headed way in the distance. And then I spent probably a year where I would go and sit in a cafe and write about 3,000 words a day that felt like progress. And then suddenly I had 90,000 words. So
yeah, that's
but I certainly
it's amazing
have,
when you just go and write every day how fast the words pile up.
Yeah. I certainly have, done more plotted stories, especially when it comes to sort of academic writing. I have spent a lot of time actually teaching writing and teaching people how to organize their thoughts so that they flow from one thing to the next. So I have that background, and sometimes that just happens in the back of my head, and sometimes I have to write it down.
Yeah, makes sense. And is it similar for character creation? Because I know often plotting and character creation can be a similar process for people, but sometimes it's very different. So how is it for you?
Most of the time, what I find is that I am that person who wants to inhabit that character and see what they think. So I don't tend to have a very difficult time starting a character and then just going, okay, if I were this person, how does that work? What are my motivations? Like, what do I care about? What do I want next? And until you get down to the very side characters, it's very easy for me to just step into that and see what they want to say. Because I mean, I've heard writers say before that their characters tell them where they want the story to go. And that certainly feels true to me, but it's not in sort of this literal sense. It's more of, how do I think this character, as I conceive of them, would realistically act? Right? So it's a sort of possession, almost, a literary possession.
That's a good way to describe it. How does that work for sort of managing like emotional arcs or character sort of development as they progress through the story? Do you have it? You just have, well, how does that work for you? Because
I will say that's something that I don't often plan out. But I have spent a lot of time thinking about how humans tick. Did a little bit of psychological research sort of things. And so I'll think about what a character is right now and what they need emotionally. what the events of the story would do to them emotionally. So like I didn't set out, for instance, to have Vera go through this arc of learning to appreciate her friend. Although I knew that there was a feeling of catharsis at the end. I knew that that moment in the celebration was going to be a cathartic moment. I didn't know exactly what it was going to be. But I had to, think about like, okay, well, why doesn't she ever go to Holy? Why does she end up at Holy? Why is it important to her at this point to go alone to celebrate her friend? It's not a celebration of death. It's not a mourning period. It's a celebration of life. So what connects these ideas? Well, okay, she's starting from a place of ignorance, like I was. So let's just walk from there. And what does she need to get from point A to point B emotionally?
I mean, and that worked perfectly. Like I was fully brought along on the journey, and like you said, I've just lost the thought I had. But the characters that you created, like they work for me. They flowed so logically. Like I understood completely. I was when she went and experienced that was, I mean, you brought me to that emotion effectively, and very effectively actually, for such a short amount of words, as well. Like you have brought right through that journey, and I very much enjoyed it. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about the process behind that, because I didn't see it on the page, for example. Like the character just worked so well for me from one step to the next that I was fully immersed in it.
And when I write, when I just sit down and write, my go-to length appears to be about 3,000 words. So what I ended up doing for both Catabasis and Holy, Holy, Holy was I wrote about 3,000 words, and then I cut and cut and cut. And so I know a lot more about Vera and Savita than was necessary for the story. And I think that helps, right?
I think so as well. I think kind of having those things in your mind really informs their actions.
Like one of the things that I ended up cutting was a sort of through line about their very different grief for their past husbands, and how they met and why they're friends. And like there was this whole bit about Vera sort of being torn between her grief, her old grief at losing her husband, and her new grief at losing her friend, in the same way that she's sort of torn between the Purim celebration and going to Holy. So where it's not a real tension of like, oh no, I can only do one of these things, but more of a just like, what am I paying attention to today? Where does my energy need to be? Where are my emotions? Where am I? And so it was going to be sort of like the 10th anniversary of her husband's death as well, and sort of a mix of an old grief that doesn't really leave you, and a new grief that brings blessings with it. And I wanted to tie that into the celebration of life angle.
Yeah, it's so interesting how sort of the process like works like that, and how what actually gets cut it still informs what you see in what happened in the story. Because I think that you brought her grief, and I'm not sure that I fully got the old grief, because I think you probably cut a lot of that information out, but the feeling was still there, that it was sort of subdued, and the grief was very real for me, which is great. I wanted to ask, and you mentioned that you write about 3,000 words kind of, and you mentioned going and doing that in a coffee shop for a year, which ties in actually to my next question, was that what does your writing process look like? And you told me about the plotting, or how you sort of get the ideas and the plotting and stuff, but are you really consistent? What is the process for you? Sort of.
So I think there is an amount of consistency that I tend to find. It wasn't really an intentional consistency exactly, but it just seems to be what happens with me, where not every single day and not every single month even, although maybe more so now, if I sit down to do creative writing, I will work for just a couple of hours and I will get about 3,000 words on the page. And then I have to stop for the day.
And why? So you have to stop for?
I have to stop there because there is a point at which I feel like it gets over bloated and like I start doing too much. And then I end up having to go in and cut lots and lots and lots more even than I cut for these stories. And it's not exactly 3,000. Sometimes it's, 2,500. Sometimes it's 4,500. But like, there will come a point in my writing where I'm like, if I push myself to keep writing, it's just going to get worse as I go. Like I've hit the end for right now.
Is that sort of because you're getting more immersed in the scene that you're writing or something, and you just want to keep exploring it, so you're kind of writing unnecessary things? Or
a bit of that, and strangely almost the opposite, where I will feel like I have said what I needed to say, and so if I push myself to write more and I don't move on to something new, it will just kind of fold over on itself and get boring. This is, again, this is something that I just came to over writing by myself for a long time. It isn't anything I think is particularly like necessary or necessarily even transferable. But for me, there's always a point that comes where I'm like, I need to stop. And this holds true when I'm writing academic works, when I'm writing scripts for my videos, when I'm writing creative work, creative fiction, although the length is very different.
That's very interesting that it sort of translates across all the categories there.
Quite honestly, I've always, ever since I learned that I'm ADHD, I've thought, this is it. Because I have this tunnel vision for this one thing that needs to get written. And then as soon as it's done, pushing myself just has diminishing returns because my brain is already on the next thing.
How come you don't sort of use that to sort of maybe jump around scenes, for example? Like if you finish one and then you just go to a radically different scene, or switch the story that you're working on.
I can switch genre. And keep writing. Like if I do a couple of hours on a video, I can switch and write a story, or I can switch and write an academic thing. But if I stay in the same kind of writing, then I feel like I'm kind of in a rut.
Well, I mean, I think that probably it makes a lot of sense with the ADHD, because it's not even just switching from working on one fantasy story to even a different fantasy story is still, as far as your thought process goes, and the activity that you're doing is you're still just like creating fiction prose. So I can absolutely see that.
And I think that relates also to why I have such varied and specific interests. I can jump right into a sci-fi story or a magical realism story, or I can dive into somebody's psychology. Actually, the short story that I submitted for the next issue, which will presumably not be qualifying, but
for the contest, no, I guess for the whole magazine. You're right. Although
the deadlines worked out such that I figured I should submit anyway, because I didn't know at that point. So that story is almost a horror story, which is really unusual for me, even more so than the magic realism. and I think, that's also why I can dive into learning ancient Greek and Sanskrit, but also be super into, modern French or psychology. So I will dive really deep in one specific place and then just go wee over somewhere else.
Which explains the very varied categories of your YouTube channel as well.
Indeed, it does.
It's more people that are going to be, interested in you and how you work and what you're interested in than people who are specifically interested in board games, for example. Do you often write in coffee shops? So you mentioned doing that. That year, were you in a coffee shop every day, or is it just you were writing every day?
I tend to work best in coffee shop environments. That's what's comfortable for me, and I miss it so much now that we're in pandemic times.
What's your favorite coffee shop? Is it like a Starbucks, or is it a local place or something like that?
So I tend to do local places. I have been known to work in a Starbucks, but I've worked. I'm around Boston, so I've worked at Kickstand. I've worked at the little place across from BU. I've worked at there's Diesel, and it more depends on where I can find somebody to work with and a good chai.
Do you often is having a partner, like a writing partner, kind of mandatory for your process?
It's not mandatory, but it helps a lot. It's much easier to stay focused when I have work buddies, and it doesn't have to be another writer, although it can be. I mentioned that I know Max. One of the things that I have done occasionally is we'll go and sit in a coffee shop and write together. That was great. I know I'll eventually read whatever he's writing. I doubt he'll read mine, but
you never know.
You never know, I guess. But yeah, I find the environment of a coffee shop, of having other people around me that are in a similar state of focus, really helps my brain calm down and not get distracted by the internet.
Do you have the internet on while you write?
Typically, yes. For one thing, if I run into something where I'm like, ooh, I had this idea, but I don't know the specifics of it. Like you said, research is a really important part of writing, and I don't want to get something wrong just because I turn the internet off, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I do typically leave that on. And sometimes these days, especially, I'll do virtual work parties with my friends. So sometimes I'm on Zoom.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask that: how has it changed for you with the pandemic?
I do live with two people, and so oftentimes we'll all sit around the dining room table and work together separately, and that's fine. But it's a lot easier when I can have other people who are sort of the people I would normally go and sit in the coffee shop with. The upside and the downside of working from home is that I have a cat. She's wonderful and very distracting.
She walk on your keyboard and get in your way and things like that?
Thankfully, no. Although I swear my housemate is trying to train her to do so.
I think I just saw the other day, and I don't know if this is true, but it kind of sounds true, was that cats are kind of doing that, getting in your way because they want to mirror you a little bit, and they're kind of interested in what you're doing. And so I think the picture was somebody got their cat like a miniature laptop and sort of just put it over here beside where they were, and the cat just hung out with that laptop instead of yours because apparently they just sort of see what you're doing and want to mirror it. And I'm not. A lot
of cats really do. It's really adorable and sometimes incredibly inconvenient.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely why I have some of my questions written down, and it says, what is your writing process like? Coffee shop, comma, at home with cat.
True story.
What are the chances? That's awesome. How does your editing process work for you? Do you find any trouble with editing, or Is it, what's the biggest challenge for writing actually with you? Which step of the?
Oh, so that's kind of two different questions, right? So
Yes. Sorry.
for
So I switched to
editing,
the what's the biggest challenge before the editing.
yeah. I think the biggest challenge for me is deciding what I want to do and when. One of the things I really liked about your particular contest is the prompt.
Yeah. Good.
That sort of was like, oh, that story that I had spinning in the back of my head for 3 years, I can put that in here instead of just, well, I have an idea to do this, and then I had this dream the other night that was kind of interesting, and like I just kind of like, I don't know what to do with this.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
much.
I mean, if a magazine just like give us your fantasy, it's like, well,
yeah,
what do I want to
okay.
write for that exactly?
Yeah. And especially the shorter it is, the more necessary I feel like a prompt is, because if I'm going to write something that has a very particular kick to it, I need to know where I'm going before I start. Because if I just go, it's going to be another 3,000 words, right? And some of these flash fiction contests I'm looking at, it's like 300 words. I'm like, and you don't have a prompt? I don't know what to do with that.
I can absolutely relate to that. That would be so difficult. I'm really glad you like the prompt. Some of the feedback I've gotten is that the prompt is some of the best parts of it.
Yeah. Although I will say one thing I thought was very interesting about this particular issue, the Merry Magic issue, is it felt, and it seems like a lot of other people felt like that was very Christmas focused. Magic, merriment, and the color red. And I saw that, and as somebody who was not even raised Christian and has kind of grown to feel like Christmas is just a month worth of microaggression all piled on top of itself, I looked at that and went, fuck it, I'm writing about Purim and Holi.
And it was a good choice. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I've grown up with Christmas my whole life. I'm not religious in any way. My family's not religious, but Christmas is just a thing. It's a very secular thing. It's not, for us, it's not in any way religious.
And that's a perfectly normal privileged stance to take, right? Like if you don't grow up actively not being Christian, that's how it feels.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is kind of all built around that in sort of a corporate way.
Mm-hmm.
But if you grow up specifically not being Christian and specifically having other traditions, it's just overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah, I can absolutely imagine that. So, and I don't even think that I really thought about it too hard doing it until really you pointed it out to me. And I'm pretty glad that I was able to ended up picking your story, for example, that had nothing at all to do with Christmas, which is, I mean, to me, it wasn't, you can write anything you want. So I received horror stories that also had nothing to do with Christmas and things like that. But I can absolutely see how that happened.
And I think there was another story in this issue that was about a phoenix and a government agent. And I that was my favorite of the other stories. Mm-hmm. Honestly, I loved seeing somebody else take that. And it was even Christmas season, like it was mentioned in the story, and it just had nothing to do with it. And that made me feel very happy. It is not that the Christmas stories were bad. Obviously, they're not.
Oh, of course.
So far, I have loved everything I've read. But it's just nice to see that contrast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think when you submit to things, especially contests that are themed or magazines that are themed, I think some of the best things you can do is sort of try and take that theme and twist it into a way that would be unusual. Because like, were I to be entering that Merry Magic issue, I would think, well, it's Christmas time for a lot of people. It's Merry Magic color red. A lot of people are going to write Christmas stories. So how can we do something that stands out, that the editor, if the judges and the editors are reading hundreds of Christmas stories, they're going to notice things that aren't more. It'll give you a better chance, at least. And it's interesting to see which people did that, and then which people took the Christmas theme and did something also that was different.
Oh yeah, like the rhyming story or the BDSM awakening.
yeah, absolutely. It's not exactly a children-friendly issue. Yeah. So, so now we'll go back to because I'm interested to hear about your editing process, because your writing process seems to be fairly intuitive. You're not kind of rigidly sticking to outlines in any way at all. So, and especially because of ADHD and how, focus and skipping around on things, how is the editing for you? What was your process for that? Because
So it depends on exactly what I'm doing. One thing that's really just necessary for me is I have to have somebody else read it over, because I can't see what I didn't see, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you do that
The
sort of the
story's
first
so
thing?
clear in my head that sometimes something goes without explanation because it's just obvious, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's really key for me. And then
Do
once I
you
have
begin
notes, I
with
can
that?
just
Like when you right when you finish, do you have somebody else read it, or are you going through and fixing up words and language and stuff to make it easier for them to read? Or
No, right when I finish, I'm like, okay, I have a draft. Let's send it to somebody who can read it and, at base, tell me if it's confusing. That's the most important thing.
mm-hmm.
But, if they happen to see a typo or something, that's great feedback. And, most of my friends are used to this by now. And so they'll send me back, a couple of notes, and I can just go off of that. And then I'll read the story again, having edited it. And it's much easier to see if something is out of whack at that point than if I just tried to read my draft straight.
Yeah, I think that's great. Getting that feedback structurally, plot wise, sort of makes a lot of sense, and doing it right away too. So you don't have any problems with showing other people your writing or anything in the early stages.
No.
For example, you had a thought there?
Well, I was just gonna say, like, I am so used to doing this by now that it is for me, like, as long as it's somebody that I know will read it and not make fun of me or anything, like,
yeah.
It's my friend. They're gonna tell me if something doesn't make sense, and they're not gonna be like, yeah, this is kind of garbage.
Yeah.
If they think it's kind of garbage, they'll be like, maybe it needs another draft or something.
A little more tact. Yeah.
Like it's much harder to show a stranger, right? But I don't have to do that. I can just, I can send it to my mom if I want, and or have a friend or a partner, or in one case even a cohort member from my scholarship days, and just send it to them. And if something doesn't work, they'll tell me, and that's fine. But sending it in to the contest was nerve-wracking.
Oh yeah.
Even though it had already been read and edited. Setting things up for public consumption is much more nerve-wracking than sending it for editing.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have no so you can't guarantee people have compunctions against being a little mean or disparaging about it if they don't like it, because obviously you're not going to please everybody.
Sure.
I still struggle with that, even though, I'm writing introductions for the magazines and I wrote comments about your story. I worry, what if you don't?
I'll tell you what made me cry is reading your comments on my story. Thank you so much.
Really?
Yeah. It's very sweet.
That's nice. Because I wanted to make it sincere, heartfelt comments, but I was also worried, what if I say something wrong? Because especially I have very little experience with the Jewish religion or the Hindu culture or any of that, really. I was Googling what Purim, how do you say that?
Yeah,
Purim. I had to Google what that was because I was completely unfamiliar with that festival, though I knew what Holy was already. But so this one especially was nerve-wracking for me because I could talk about fantasy and I know what I'm talking about, but these things were a little bit further out of my range, and I wanted to be very careful not to offend somebody, but I also wanted to say the things that I felt about the story and what it made me think and experience. And of course, that's always going to be a little nerve-wracking because specifically I wanted you to enjoy it or get something out of it, and at the very least not hate me for it.
Well, I think you did a fine job. I was very touched.
I'm very glad about that. So I can absolutely relate with you on sending it out, but you did it, and you sent out a second one, and it got published too, and won a contest. And you've sent out a third one, which will not get published or win a contest here,
No,
but it may somewhere else. Having been published now, would you be more confident submitting your work to other publications, for example?
I think I must be. I've already started looking at other places to submit, since now I have a story that I need to send somewhere, right?
Yeah. Find somebody with appropriate theme.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this has given me a ton of confidence that I definitely did not feel before. It's one thing to have your friends tell you that something you wrote is good or that moved them, and another thing to put it out into the world and see that the public likes it too.
Yeah, having a complete stranger, like your work and having more people read it's a good feeling.
Yeah,
absolutely. So, and I'm very glad that we could help bring some of that confidence to the forefront. It's one of the things that we're trying to do here is make a big impact on new authors and sort of help people. So
I love the mission of this. It's a really fantastic idea, and I'm glad you're doing it.
Thank you. Yeah, me
and
too.
Not just for me.
A little biased on your part now, but that's.
But I like the idea of it. There's so many people out there who have something to write, mm-hmm. and will never get seen, and have no faith that they'll ever get seen, and so to be welcomed onto something is really nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad. And I'm a absolutely voracious reader, and I couldn't get through all the books that I want to get through in a lifetime. I think many of us are probably just like that. But the side effect of doing this is it's just gives me an insane amount of stories to read that I otherwise wouldn't. It's just, and I love it. I just get to read all these amazing concepts and wonderful stories, even the ones that aren't selected. There's tons of great stuff in there too.
Did I read you had 71 entries for this last month?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yeah. So here's a question I like to ask people. That's kind of unrelated, but is there a very useful product that you have purchased that was under $100, or even under 50 or something in the last 6 months, and probably writing related, but it could be anything if you want, that you just found very useful?
Now there's one I haven't thought about. In the under 100 range is a little bit hard because the most important things that I've gotten for myself that have just made life easier, I bought myself a new office chair. And that has made a world of difference. It's so much easier to just sort of sit at the table and write.
Mm-hmm. Are you sitting in it right now?
No, I'm not. This is my filming space, actually. You'll recognize it if you go see my YouTube channel. But my housemates are working out there, so I didn't want to disturb them.
And I thought the wooden wicker chair behind you probably wasn't the new office chair.
No, neither new nor an office chair. This one we inherited with the house, I think.
Yeah, that happens.
But I guess let's see, what else have I even bought recently aside from a brand new computer, which was not cheap.
Yeah. Certainly an office chair. If you can't think of one that's under 100, that's a comfortable place to sit to write gives you the ability to sit longer, which means you can write more in many people's cases. And that can make a huge impact.
And actually the reason I ended up getting it is I had been sitting on the couch and I started to ruin my wrists because I was typing the wrong angle. So I think I'm gonna stick with that. Like, it's just made
that's definitely is still a good answer. For sure. And you sat on a couch to write sort of regularly. I wouldn't be able to do that.
We have a table that lifts up. So like I could sit on the couch and have something at almost the right height, but obviously it wasn't quite right. So
That's I actually what my laptop is currently sitting on to give it a little bit more height for this conversation is one of these sort of laptop stands, but it's got these angular modular legs. So it can be quite taller, it can be small, it can be angled. So it's very good. You know, if I was to sit on a couch now with this, I could set this up and it kind of goes across your lap. Or if you really extend it to the maximum, you could almost make it its own table if you were to sit in a chair that didn't have a table. I specifically bought it because I went through a phase where I went to the museum to do my writing, because it's nice, you know, you want to take a break, you walk around, you look at some old history and some artifacts, and things can inspire you, and you comes out of nowhere. And I like that. But the problem was the only seating in the museum was the benches in the middle of the exhibits and the odd chair. They had lots of comfortable chairs sort of around the outskirts of galleries, but there were no tables or anything. So I had to get myself this extendable thing to make that work.
I'm actually on a fairly similar platform right now. There's no proper table here. This is what I use for filming, actually.
Mm-hmm. You have a wonderful display behind you too. I can recognize some of the books, the Tad Williams. I think that's the other world.
So the Otherland ones.
Otherland, that's what it's called.
This is the one I like much better, which is the fantasy series, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn.
Mm-hmm. And you like that better than the other world? I absolutely loved Otherland.
Otherland was really interesting, but it was surprisingly sloggy. Like, I would get invested in one story and then it wouldn't come back for another like 200 pages. Whereas Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, the characters were so compelling. And then of course I have Tail Chaser's song somewhere. And so, you know, can't beat cats, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think my last question for you, we've actually been talking over an hour. That's great. And it's been very informative. I've very enjoyed it.
Feel free to cut that down.
Well, there's not too much I'd cut out of here. But if I were to send you into the future, you know, a year from now, where do you see yourself being, or where would you like to see yourself being? What's the greatest outcome you could imagine in a year from now?
Well, I would like to see myself in a world where people take the pandemic seriously enough to end it.
Yeah,
that's one thing. But I think that if a year from now I can either be on the road to self-publishing or have found a serious agent for my book, that would be really great. And I'd also really like to have my YouTube channel take off. I think I really want my creative works to start getting out into the world in a more serious fashion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And paying the bills.
That's sort of my goal for the year.
And paying the bills so you can. Do you have another job at the moment or something? Or are you fully focused on the creative pursuits?
So I've been taking sort of like odd freelance jobs, like I said. I have an editing and publishing background, so I've done a little bit of that. And then like I've done some writing tutoring, some history tutoring, just as it comes. But I don't have another job. Leaving academia was a big break for me in terms of grief and loss and anger, and I wasn't ready to do something new. And I mean, you know, thank goodness for the privilege that I have to be able to do that, because I know that most people can't. Mm-hmm. But I have the leeway to not worry about finding a new full-time job immediately. I have been looking because, like you said, there are bills. Still got to live in capitalism, unfortunately.
Yeah.
At least as of now.
Well, I very much hope that your YouTube channel does take off, and that I'm sure that you will end up finding an agent or self-publishing. Self-publishing is always an option, but it's very important, I think, to attack it strategically. Otherwise, you know, there's everybody's putting out things that they haven't even edited. So
Mhm.
you've done that, and then you've got sort of a solid book. You're one leg up there, and then if you get a little bit of a marketing plan in place, things like that, I'm sure that you'll be just fine if you don't get an agent. But I mean, I very much enjoy your writing, and I
Thank
certainly
you.
think I would love to read the book when it comes out, see it on a bookshelf. So that's great.
I appreciate that.
That's all the questions I have for you right now. Do you have anything to ask me before I end the recording?
No, I don't think so.
Fantastic. Well, it was absolutely lovely to be speaking with you. It was lovely to publish your
Likewise.
work, and I hope that anybody who's watching this, if they haven't read it for some reason, to will go and read it, because it was a fantastic story.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.